Okay. Awesome. Okay, so we're talking about government and the economy. So I know y'all have been through economics already. I have no clue what you're taught in economics. I don't really know anything about economics, which is a lie. I know a lot about economics, but I don't know, like, I've never taught it in Texas, so I don't know like what the expectations are that you learn here. That being said, you can't learn government without learning economics. And you have to do more than just like supply and demand. Because it's my understanding that that's like all you learn. Supply and demand and aggregate demand and this type of demand and that type of demand and whatever. Right, we're looking at economic activity as it pertains to public policy, right? And so public policy is simply a very broad blanketed statement that really refers to any sort of governmental policy, right? So like anything that the government does that it requires of, you know, you or the people or citizens or some subset of the population, that's public policy. When it comes to economic public policy, the government does set a number of different rules for economic policy. And so it's trying to regulate the economy because as much as we love like, yay, capitalism in this country, right? Like, capitalism is awesome. That's what we believe. That's what we claim to believe. Unchecked capitalism is actually kind of bad, right? Or at least it can be. And it's one of those sort of concepts. If you go back to when we first began this class, right? Like we talked about the idea, you know, that government is sort of a necessary evil. Like even our founders were like, "Yay, freedom and liberty, and like everybody do what they want." Then they also went, "People kind of suck, and some of them are terrible, and so we need to have some basic rules." Same concept with capitalism, right? Like, yeah, we want free markets and we want free economic like opportunities, and we want you know, the government to not be involved in economic decisions, but there's some really bad people who would do some really sort of like gnarly things, and so the government will set some rules, right? Additionally, the government is also responsible for printing money, which is obviously economic in its nature. Although the government's like pseudo-responsible for printing money. That's a very complex issue with something called the Fed, which is the Federal Reserve, which is basically the Bank of the United States, except it's not accountable to the United States, which makes it kind of interesting because they can do what they want sometimes. Okay? So goals of economic public policy, right? Like, why do we do this? The goals are pretty simple, right? We want to have basic economic stability, right? We want to promote economic growth, right? We want to promote the business development, right? And then we want to protect like the people, right? Both employees and consumers, and you'll see different like things that we do in that regard. Okay. So we do have some regulation of markets. Obviously, market stability within markets is necessary for general stability within the economy. And so we're going to protect, you know, like things like contractual obligations, right? Like that's something that the government enforces and protects. So if you engage in a business relationship with somebody else, you have a contractual agreement, they violate it, you can take that to the government, to the courts, and get it remediated, right? Government does provide public goods, and predominantly public goods are aimed at or meant to help in terms of economic growth or economic stimulation, right? So like the interstate highway system, for example, like public roads are public goods, everybody can drive on them, but they exist in order to help facilitate the transportation of goods from one part of the United States to another part of the United States, which is obviously wildly beneficial. You know, that way, if you live in, say, like my wife hates the fact that she can't get like decent peaches, right? Because like she grew up in Carolinas, and South Carolina and Georgia, they grow a lot of peaches, so she loves peaches, right? But that's sort of one of the concepts of public goods. It's one of the ways where the government can sort of get around governmental overreach or social, or even things like Republicans complain about, right? Like Republicans are like, oh, you're spending too much money and government's doing too much, right? But then the government's like, well, we're building roads and like dams to create electricity, so that like one of the things that I haven't read Biden's like infrastructure bill because I just don't have time to read 1,000-page long pieces of legislation anymore with 3 children. But yeah, sadly, I used to do that. I'm kind of a nerd. Yeah, I didn't read the full 1,000 pages, but like I would read large chunks. Anyway, I would hope that one of the aspects of that plan is to provide like broadband internet access. I'm personally a believer. This is my own personal opinion. You don't have to agree with me. I don't really care. But I personally think that the internet is now sort of a necessity in order to be like free, right? Because the internet has access to all information and like free press and things like that. So I would hope that we would actually classify the internet as sort of a public good, right? Any sort of infrastructure is public good. And if you don't know what infrastructure means, because it's a word that gets thrown around a lot now, like I just said, that's Biden's infrastructure bill. It's to increase or redo roads, like improve roads, improve, you know, the like power lines and you know, like water, like I'm in Flint, Michigan, where they have the lead infested water, like the yellow water that you can't drink or you'll die. It's been there for like we've known about it for like 6 years. God knows. God, no. So apparently the governor of Michigan is finally, like 2 months ago, they finally indicted him for like gross negligence. But the reality is, and here's the thing, like and this is one of those reasons why you'll understand, like I generally hate all politicians, right? Because like nobody expected Obama to care much about Trump. Right, like nobody really expected Trump to care about like a whole bunch of poor people in Michigan, which is, you know, generally a Democratic state, like, you know, whatever, right? Like Republicans they don't spend money anyway. Like that's sort of this. But like this was brought about during Obama's administration. Like Obama didn't do nothing about it. Like Biden still ain't done nothing about it. Like, I mean, it does get to the concept of, you know, what is a sort of right? I mean, do we have a right to clean water? Which, believe it or not, is more of a loaded question in terms of public policy than you think. And the next chapter that we'll go over is social policy, right? Where we'll talk about things like healthcare. Like you have a right to healthcare, right? And there's people that believe that you absolutely have a right to healthcare, and there are people that believe that you do not have a right to healthcare, that it's simply a good. It's like a car, right? Like, could you go get one? Absolutely. Does somebody have to provide one for you? No, they do not, right? And so it just depends upon how you decide that. So again, prosperity is one of the goals. We want economic growth. Economic growth is generally measured in GDP, which is gross domestic product, which is basically the total, the sum figure of all goods and services that are produced domestically, right? So there is gross national product, which includes like exports, basically, or funding outside of the United States. But generally, GDP is the more readily accepted indicator of economic development. Obviously, GDP is not stable. It shifts. Hopefully, I would hope that you would learn. And obviously, the people in the video can't really see this, so I would advise you to go look up the sort of business cycle. That's the term. But I would hope that you would learn this in economics. But as a general rule, within any capitalist system, right, like this is the general state of the economy, right? So what you have is you have periods of expansion, and you have periods of recession and expansion, recession, expansion, recession, expansion. And so long as you have like a general, like literally, this is 1970 over here, right? And this is 2020 over here, and we're looking at 50 years, right? As long as we go like, here was 1970, and we draw a straight line, and here's 2020, yay, the line has a positive, like we're growing the economy, right? You really can't measure economic growth on like a day-to-day basis, despite what some Republicans want to do when they're like, look at the stock market, because that is another indicator, although it's not necessarily a good indicator, right? In order to have economic prosperity, there are a number of different things that have to be met. It's not simple. It's not as simple as just being like, hey, buy stuff, right? Like, you do need like political stability to go along with that. You need, again, decent infrastructure. You do need rule of law, again, so that you have things like, you ensure that everybody's on the same playing field economically, right? So, if you buy something, what you pay for it is going to be basically the same or relatively similar to what somebody else pays for. Right now, obviously, like you can go to Kroger and HEB and try to shop for the best deal for milk, right? If you don't know, Kroger's milk is actually cheaper than HEB's milk, right? I know because I've got kids and we drink a lot of milk in my house, right? And it's fairly significant, right? So, I mean, literally, you can get a gallon of milk at Kroger for like $1.99, and a gallon of milk at HEB is like $2.70, right? So, I mean, it's 80 cents, which is not like obviously huge. But when you talk about the difference between $2 and $3, that's actually, it's a 50% markup. So in that regard, it's actually fairly substantial. And but what we're really talking about, when we talk about sort of rule of law and like standards and that, like I'm not going directly to a farmer and like getting milk for 10 cents, and then you're paying like $40 for your milk, right? Or we don't price gouge certain communities. Sort of similar, y'all should be old enough to remember Harvey, right? Like, people went without water, like for almost a week, right? Supermarkets at that point couldn't just be like, oh, this case of water is now $100, right? Oh, you need water to survive? Yeah, this case of water is now $100. In a true capitalist system, like, yeah, by all means, you absolutely do that. Supply and demand, right? Demand went up, supply went down, price goes up, right? But we do want to have basic regard for the law so that we have some level of stability, right? We call it rule of law in politics, like everybody's subject to the same laws, but we want sort of the same concept economically, which is why we do have economic regulation, right? The SEC is a good example, which is the Securities and Exchange Commission. This would be the entity that ensured that like Martha Stewart went to prison, right? You don't know who Martha Stewart is. She's like, ask your mother. Your mother will know who Martha Stewart is.
What you do?
What?
She's a cooking lady.
Yeah, like cooking, homemaker. Like she's got like a line of like home stuff at Target and things like that. She engaged in what is called insider trading, right? Which is illegal. So basically, she got a tip on something, and then she used that knowledge to make money on the stock market that was unfair because not everybody else had that knowledge, right? So if I had a company and I called you up and I was like, hey, Sierra, I'm about to get this like government contract, right? Like it's not gone through yet, like nobody knows, but the government's about to buy like a whole bunch of widgets off of me, right? Like whatever I'm making, okay? And so I have this obscure, like nothing, like no name company. Okay, but all of a sudden I'm going to get like a multi-billion-dollar deal from the U.S. government. So I tell you to go buy as much of my stock as you can afford right now, right? Because right now my stock is like $5 a share, and which means you take, let's just say for the sake of argument, you have $500 laying around, right? So you buy 100 shares of my stock, and then this information comes out. What happens to the stock price? It skyrockets. It goes up drastically, right? because now the value of my company would be seen as much higher because I've got a multi-billion-dollar deal with the government, right? So my company is going to continue to make money, right? So now stock prices go up drastically. Those $5 shares become $100 shares, right? You had 100 of them. Now you sell them $100 each. What do you make? $10,000. You make $10,000 for a $500 investment. Pretty good deal, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. The problem is I gave you information that you shouldn't have had access to. You're going to jail and I'm going to jail. Well, whoever is running the company, because it's a public company at this point, it's a publicly traded company. So there's a board of investors, and everybody that owns stock technically owns a little bit of the company. That's actually what stock is. Not that you really need to know that for this course. You should have learned that in economics, though I would hope. Stock is ownership in a company, right? So every stock holding member of a company owns a very, very teeny tiny fraction of that company. And so when the company makes decisions, sometimes the shareholders, the stock owners, get to make those decisions. But then it's like a democracy and everybody votes, but they vote based on the number of shares they have. So if I have 1 share and you have 5 shares, you get 5 votes, I get 1 vote, right? So if somebody owns 50,000 shares, like they get 50,000 votes, right? So then whoever's, I mean, the company would continue even while I did my 6 months in prison, right? And I mean, it's 6 months, it's white collar prison. I'd be out there playing tennis and swimming in a pool. It's not like, it's not like I gotta worry about dropping the soap. We're not talking about that kind of prison. I'm just saying, there's a huge difference. I know because my uncle went to white collar prison. Yeah, there's really white collar prisons.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, my uncle went to prison for like 8 months, because there was a family company in West Virginia that he ended up taking over upon my great grandfather's death. But they got caught burying toxic waste illegally. It was a gasoline company, and so they were in gross violation of like EPA standards and like environmental law. And yeah, so he went to prison for like 8 months, but literally like minimum security.
Walk around.
Oh yeah, like literally, it's almost like a school. Like literally, there's bells. It's like it's time to go to the cafeteria. All right, like lunchtime, I guess. Like, well, I'm not joking when I say he's playing tennis. He's playing tennis in prison, right? It's not like maximum security, like you're getting beaten with batons by the officers kind of prison. Like that's not the case. Another thing the government can do in order to sort of help economic prosperity, the government actually creates policies that are aimed at innovation, right? Aimed at ways of trying to bolster sort of progress, societal progress. So for instance, like you look at COVID-19, because it's actually a really good example. The US government was basically providing companies and telling companies like, hey, we're going to spend billions and billions of dollars on your vaccine if you can get a vaccine for COVID-19, right? Some of the other things that they can do, there's different entities within government have different ways of doing this. Sometimes it's sort of promising to purchase something after the fact. Sometimes it's actually funding, like government funded research into like, literally the government will give Johnson & Johnson money and be like, hey, we would like you to research this, right? And so Johnson & Johnson just takes the money, right? And then hopefully they, cure male pattern baldness or erectile dysfunction or some other disease aimed at men, because we don't study things about women, nobody cares. Ladies, I'm sure you all already figured that out though, right? Like, you do realize that though, right?
No.
Oh yeah, like medical research, medical research goes into things for like male dominated diseases. Oh yeah. Like you realize that women who have like incredibly bad had like menstrual cycles and like significant amounts of pain, I'm frequently told like, oh, suck it up, it's not that big a deal. Like, you're fine, you're not really in pain. Women endure childbirth, which is way more pain than any dude can handle. So don't tell women like, oh, you just need to toughen up, honey.
They can have that extra being like, oh, you're just involved. That hurts way worse.
Well, okay, one, I've been hit in that region, and it is ridiculously painful for like 3 minutes. Some women are in labor for 36 hours, so yeah, not really comparable. Yeah, not comparable. Yeah, but it's sad. You know, and here's the other thing. We spend, like, if you actually look, especially at like medical stuff, it's kind of sad. Like, it's actually really sad. Because the other thing we do is we spend significant sums of money researching things for like old people, right? Like, and trying to fix things for old people. Like, bro, you're 90. Your time's up. Like, it's time to go, dude. Like, just go home and make peace with your maker and like call it a day. Like, we're good. I would much rather spend this money on the 6-year-old so that they can hear for the rest of their life. Because they will be, you know what I mean? Whatever. Like, we don't do that. With all of these government behaviors, a couple of things they're looking for. Government wants employment. They actually don't really want full employment. Full employment is like 100% employment is bad. Like, if you have 0% unemployment, that's actually bad, believe it or not. Because generally what that will entail is that you have unfilled positions, and you also have people in positions for which they're not really qualified, right? Because businesses just have to hire and hire and hire whoever they can find, right? And now all of a sudden, like, you know, I would be running like a research laboratory, you know, trying to figure out how to stop testicular cancer or whatever, right? Which I would be grossly unqualified to do. The government also wants low inflation, right? Inflation is a completely natural phenomenon. Okay, it happens. You can't stop inflation because of all sorts of factors, but you don't want what is called hyperinflation. And I'm gonna be honest with you, if we had more time, and if you want, we can do this tomorrow when we can just have like fun and talk about stuff. I will explain to you why in your lifetime you will live through hyperinflation and you will live through the Great Depression. And when I say the Great Depression, I mean the depression that you will live through in your lifetime will make the 1930s seem like a cakewalk.
So this level right now.
What?
This level right now.
No. Oh God, no. No. Here's the thing. No. Right? So there's an old saying, right? There's an old saying when it goes back to like wars, when there's blood on the streets, buy property, right? And what that means is that if you, like, let's say you go into like downtown Minnesota right now, right? Like, would you want to own anything in Minneapolis, right? Where there's all the protesting and the riots and like people are destroying buildings. Would you want to own something in downtown Minneapolis right now? No, you don't, do you? So the people that do own that stuff, are they trying to sell it? They trying to sell it cheap? Guess what? It ain't gonna be like that forever. So you swoop in right now, you buy that stuff cheap, hold on to it for a little while until the market rebound there, and then you sell it for a big old profit. So not only am I going to teach you like why hyperinflation will happen, I'm going to teach you how to come out the other side just rich. Okay? So, but yeah, like inflation again. If you go back and you think, you know, I'll give you a couple of sort of examples, right? Like the average price of a home in the United States today, and I haven't looked this up in a couple of years, but so I'm going to make the number up, but I'll be relatively close, is probably about $180,000, right? That's probably the average price of a home in the United States. If you go back 40 or 50 years ago, right, the average price of a home in the United States was probably about $30,000. Okay? Same thing with cars, right? The average price of a car 40 years ago was, you know, $7,000 or $8,000 or whatever it was. Now the average price of an automobile is like $32,000, right? which is just basic inflation. And now those are actually two examples that are actually way more than regular inflation. Really, when we're talking about like regular inflation, you would look at things like, you know, things you would buy all the time, whether it would be like a loaf of bread or, you know, things like that, those types of commodities, which have seen much, much smaller growth percentage-wise, right, in terms of percentage growth. Okay? But no, like homes, cars, healthcare, and college are the four that have grown have been inflated disproportionately, right? In order to promote businesses, the government does obviously needs to have infrastructure, right? Ways to transport things and ways to interact and deal with all that stuff. One of the things that the government does is it can provide grants. Okay? Grants are basically government money for things. You might have actually heard that term because you might be in the process of applying for a Pell Grant right now, right? What?
Absolutely.
I don't know exactly what FAFSA is. So it's a little bit different when I went to college because obviously I was on the GI Bill, which is slightly different. But Pell, like I know the Pell Grant is a grant for education, and grants are basically just free money. Like it's kind of free money. The government gives free money to states and local entities as well in order to build infrastructure and do things like that. Because obviously it's not feasible for the national government to oversee everything. It's a lot easier for the national government to give money to the state and local government and be like, hey, expand Highway 59, right? So that more cars can come through. And government also provides loans and subsidies, right? So loans are obviously like money that has to be repaid. Subsidies are essentially loans that don't have to be repaid. Okay, so subsidies are given for things like natural disasters, right? You've had a number of government subsidies as a result of COVID-19 because small businesses have been given like money to keep people on their payroll, especially like restaurants that haven't been able to open, right? So that way the restaurants can still pay their employees, so the people are still employed and still making money, despite the fact that the business isn't open. And government needs sort of stable relations. The government actually does get involved in labor negotiations from time to time, although for the most part, over the last 40-ish years, the United States has basically, and states, it's really been done on a state-by-state basis, has been passing the right to work laws, which sort of drastically decrease union membership, which decreases labor strife, right? Because it's one of those things where like if I told you all this shit, like you're not going to change the world,
Yeah.
right? But you could change the world if your group did it, right? Okay, same concept with like unions. Like it's really, really hard. Like I can't go to the school board and be like, I deserve a raise, and they're gonna be like, yeah, you do. We don't have money. Sorry, go away, right? But like if you have a teachers union and all the teachers got together and all the teachers like, we all deserve a raise, and if you don't give us a raise, we're all gonna walk off the job and we're gonna go on strike. Now you have a lot more authority, right? Like you have a lot more negotiating power, right? Because if I go on strike by myself and I stand outside the school with my little picket sign being like, hey, teachers more, people are like, there's crazy Coach Baker, and I get fired because I've missed too many days of work, right? On the other hand, if every teacher does that outside of every school, right, and then the schools can't staff the schools, then they have to send the kids home, and then if the kids stay home, the schools don't get money for the kids that day, and now all of a sudden the teachers have a fair amount of like pull, and they can actually get some of the stuff they want. That's basically what unions do. But the government from time to time has gone in and basically like, we're gonna kill like labor strife. Like Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, for instance, basically nationalized air traffic controllers, right? Because air traffic controllers it's one of the most like intense, strenuous, difficult jobs in America, right? They are the people responsible for ensuring that there are no like airplane accidents, right? Because when you drive out of the school parking lot and you have your little fender bender because you're a terrible driver, no big deal, right? Like you both walk away and you're fine. How many people walk away from airplane crashes? Very few, right? Especially when it's plane on plane, right? So you have to make sure, and when you talk about like really, really, really busy international airports, right? Like if you fly enough, you will eventually see this, especially if you're in a very busy airport. Like I have been on an airplane before where I've been sitting there like waiting to take off, and another airplane comes literally like right over the top of you and lands. And you're like, holy crap, if that dude was like this much worse of a pilot, I'm dead, right? But these air traffic controllers are literally organizing all of this stuff so that this dude lands, right, and decreases his speed and then turns off as this plane begins to increase its speed so it can take off, and then the next one pulls in, and this one is literally landing as this one is taking off, and it's like a final wheel machine, right? But here's the thing. When air traffic controllers in the 1980s was like, yeah, we're gonna go on strike, what would happen?
Dead people.
You would either have a lot of dead people, or you would just have to stop all airplanes.
Yeah.
No airplanes take off now, period. Well, we can't do that. You can't just stop that level of transportation, because think about like FedEx, right? Or things like that that are flying commerce, not just people, but now like products and services. Like it's way too much. So the government does do that from time to time. The government will also take some precautions to help consumers. You know, obviously the FDA, you want to make sure that if you take, you know, aspirin or a COVID vaccine, that COVID vaccine is not going to kill you, right? I mean, the COVID vaccine is probably a bad example because it very well might, because we don't know, right? Sorry, I know you've already had it. Oh, you've already had both? All right, just let me know when that third arm hurts. No, I'm kidding. But like, if you actually follow that, like literally the FDA approved the Johnson & Johnson vaccine not long ago, and they literally pulled it yesterday, right? Because now all of a sudden there's a side effect to it, and they're like, oh crap, like, but that's better than like no Food and Drug Administration, and then you just have to take Johnson & Johnson's word for it, right? And like, how many of you have a medical degree where you could actually look at the data on their like clinical trials and figure out if their vaccine was effective and safe? Anybody? Yeah, no, none of us can do that. Like, right? Like your doctor could probably do it, but they don't have time for that because they're busy treating you, right? And did you learn about Upton Sinclair's The Jungle in U.S. history? The meat packing industry? No? The 2 years ago. So see, that's another thing, like the FDA does. So, because think about it, right? Like, unless you're a vegetarian or a vegan, right? Like you eat meat, right? So if you go to the grocery store and you get some ground beef, how do you know it's ground beef? I can put a big old sign on your forehead right now that says idiot. That don't make you an idiot, right? So how do you know it's ground beef? I could write whatever I wanted on that, couldn't I? So that's the thing, because 100 some odd years ago, right, there were no standards for the meat packing industry, right? And if you understand anything about meat packing, like stuff like that, like literally there are these massive, massive like blades, like jigsaw blades that you like feed whole cows through, like cut them in half, right? Well, you're not paying attention, right? See, like y'all don't have wood shop in school anymore. Like when I was in school, you had wood shop, and inevitably every couple of years, a kid would cut their finger off. Because that just, I mean, kids are stupid, right? Like that happens, okay? And then, you know, like the wood shop teacher would have to like clean up all the blood and like pack the finger on ice, and you gotta go to the hospital and get it re-sewn back on, right? In a meat packing plant, when you lose that finger and it goes down the conveyor belt, what happened to it? It got ground up into the ground beef. So now that hamburger you eating on the 4th of July, that's a little Steve burger. And you a cannibal, right? How many of you would be okay with cannibalism? I mean, if I'm starving, maybe, let me just be honest with you, right? I was in the Marine Corps, I've eaten some terrible stuff. But obviously, we want to make sure that that's not the case, right? So the FDA exists for that. Again, you want to make sure that when it says ground beef, it's beef, right, and not pork, because for a lot of people religiously, that makes a difference, right? So you need to have some level of protection there in that regard. Laissez-faire economics is basically the theory that this is what capitalism is, like the economy and the market will take care of itself. There's some truth to that, but we still do have regulation. So when we say laissez-faire capitalism, really you could talk about laissez-faire capitalism as it relates to like the Masterpiece Cake Shop in Colorado, right? If you don't know about that, that's the Supreme Court case about the religious dude in Colorado that refused to bake a cake for a gay couple, right? Laissez-faire economics basically says don't do anything, right? If that dude doesn't want to serve gay people, he ain't got to serve gay people, right? And then all the gays can be like, he's the bigot and he's terrible and protest, and that's awesome. They can do that. And if he goes out of business, well, then the market decided he's a moron and he should have been made a gay wedding, right? And conversely, if a whole bunch of like, you know, West Baptist church people, like, you know, the crazy people that protest everything, right? Like if they're like, hey, he's the Christian hero, let's all go buy cupcakes from him, and his business makes money, then okay, then he's, you know, right? That's the idea of laissez-faire capitalism. That basically we as the people with our money, we decide what is and is not sort of acceptable business practices. And so there's certainly some aspects of that, although not all. Keynesian economics is really what we operate under. And so Keynesian economics is basically the idea that when we're right here, when we're in this expansionary period, right, taxes in an expansionary period go up, right, and government spending should go down, and this should control inflation. And then when we come down here and we're in a recessionary period, right, now we're going to decrease taxes and we're going to increase spending in order to stimulate economic growth. That's basically what Keynesian economics says. The problem with that is despite the fact that that's what we believe and like that's what we practice, that is not what we practice, because when do our taxes ever go up? They don't. Because if a politician raises taxes, what happens to them? They lose their job, right? They get voted out, they lose their job. Bush, it happened to Bush 1, right? Like literally he was in a period where he needed to raise taxes, and he did raise taxes, and it cost him his job. Why did it cost him his job? Okay, we're gonna take a tax from you just being in this room. Give me your money. You okay with that? Nobody's okay with taxes. Nobody likes taxes. But here's the problem too, because nobody understands economics, the layperson, like you, me, like economics is so complex that literally Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has a degree in economics, right? And she has this whole idea of how the economy should work, right? And then there's like the Austrian school of economics. You have a whole bunch of economics people over here with like PhDs that have degrees in economics that think the exact opposite of her, right? Like 2 people with a PhD in economics can believe the exact opposite thing. Because in reality, economics is this theoretical study. It's not a practical study, which means when you study theory, like what should happen? Well, the sun should rise tomorrow, right? It should. But at some point in that big old bulb gonna burn out. It couldn't be right now, right? So the sun should rise tomorrow, but we can't be 100% certain of that. When you look at economics, we have all these should. This should happen. If we do A and B and C, then D should happen. But there's also so many factors that it's not just A and B and C. There's A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, U, V, A1, A2, A3, A4. Like, so there's no way to account for all of it. So then when you're like, well, D should happen, but it ain't gonna happen, right? Which is why you have like vastly different beliefs. So when it comes to that, then the people are like, well, why you gotta raise the taxes? I don't think you need to raise taxes. And nobody's okay with taxes. Everybody hates taxes because and you willingly, voluntarily want to just give up money? Because if you do, I will gladly take it. I have 3 small children, If you want to just hand people money instead of giving it to the government, by God, you can give it to me. I will gladly take it. Right? Like this is the whole thing with Donald Trump, right? Like people are like, oh, Donald Trump didn't pay his taxes. Yeah, because Donald Trump took advantage of tax loopholes that exist. Like, don't get mad at him. I promise you, not a one of you in this room would pay taxes if you didn't have to. You wouldn't. Right? Like even the people are like, oh, rich people should pay more taxes. Well, you pay more if you want. Right? Like you want to just cut a check to the IRS? Because you can. Like people are like, well, that's not how it works. You can't do that. Apparently you can, because that's what Donald Trump did with his paycheck every single year when he was president. His little $400,000 paycheck, he just like signed it over to a department. Like here, Health and Human Services, right? COVID, Health and Human Services. There's $400,000 in this thing, right? He didn't need the money, and so you could, but nobody's going to do it because nobody wants to tax, right? There's another idea, we'll call it supply side economics. People on the left call it trickle down economics. It doesn't work, but the idea here is basically that if you decrease taxes drastically and specifically amongst the job creators, that you will eventually like poor people get that money as well. That's not 100% true because obviously we have like billionaires that just hoard their own wealth. They don't trickle it down, right? Yeah, when it comes to spending, we also don't really ever decrease spending in that regard. Because once government policies are enacted, right, like people depend on that money and they don't want to see that stop. And don't really care about that. The Fed, we actually got to cover monetary policy real quickly. So the Fed controls the monetary supply. Basically, they do that through interest rates and reserve rates. And so in order to like decrease the monetary supply, they increase inflation, or excuse me, they increase interest rates, and they increase the reserve requirement for banks in order to decrease it, or when they decrease it, that's supposed to increase the monetary supply, which is supposed to create economic growth. But if you really want to, well, we'll talk about actual monetary like values tomorrow when we talk about why there's going to be massive inflation. Yeah, I don't care about that. Yeah, you got to pay income taxes. That sucks. You'll have to at some point in time. There we go. That's it. You can go. Appreciate y'all hanging with me.